All right. Hello and happy Monday, everybody. Welcome to Patristicast. I'm very delighted to welcome Dr. Lewis Ayres onto the show today. And, my better half, Don Springer, is here as well, and he's going to be taking much of the lead in this. So I'm going to turn it over to Don for now. Don, take it away.
Thank you, John, and welcome to Lewis. Thank you for joining us today. Just for a few comments of introduction, of course, Dr. Ayres is professor of Catholic and Historical Theology at Durham University, where you've been for 10 or 12 years now, I do believe, Lewis, and author of many, many publications, including a couple of very important volumes on Nicaea and its legacy, and on Augustine on the Trinity. That being said, I think the scholarly consensus is that your career really took off after paying more attention to Irenaeus. Is that, I think that's the consensus, isn't it? So anyway, Lewis, thank you for joining us. I trust you and your family are well these days.
We are all still alive, thank you, and none of us have caught the plague.
That's good. I was thinking, I saw you have the plague. Yeah, that's a concern, isn't it? I saw you have 4 children, and my in-laws they grew up not far from Durham there in Hartlepool. And that's quite a unique accent up there. Now, you yourself have a fairly refined British accent, but are your kids, is there anything that comes even close to a Geordie accent among any of them?
Faintest hint, I'm afraid. I can't do it. I mean, I can barely communicate with the locals. I grew up in a small village near London, and my grandfather on my mother's side was the one who had most influence on me. And he always used to warn me about foreigners. And he would indicate where the line of villages started, after which you encountered foreigners. So the north was a long way off.
I was going to say, it probably wasn't a line that was very far off, was it?
No, it was about 20 miles, yeah.
Yes, very good. First of all, I would love to hear a little bit about even just your own story and what it was that drew you to patristics in the first place.
I as an undergraduate, I majored in classics at St. Andrews in Scotland. And at the same time, I was wondering what I was going to do. And at that time, I thought that I would somehow end up as one of those sort of very traditional Oxford or Cambridge ordained chaplain figures who does something on the side. I was beginning to get an interest in Augustine, actually, although how is a good story I won't go into just now. And I happened to be encouraged to go on a retreat with some Benedictines for Holy Week. And it was hearing the fathers read out as sort of living voices in the office of readings that made me recognize I want to do patristics, because these are the guys we should do theology with. And the very first theology books that I bought, oddly, were a copy of Losky's Mystical Theology and Balthazar's book about prayer. Oh, yeah. So that was where I started in theology as a classics student. And I did my sort of honors thesis as an undergrad on Augustine and just continued doing that. Mm-hmm. But obviously enough, I did not end up as the Oxford or Cambridge chaplain.
You studied under Rowan Williams, is that right?
Mm-hmm. I had a very good, in the Scottish system, it's a slight variation of the normal British system where you decide what you're going to major in at 18 and then you just do it. In the Scottish system, it's a 4-year degree program and you have to take a range of courses from other departments outside your own. So I had started taking some courses in the theology department, and I became friendly with a very old faculty member who's now passed on, unfortunately, and I was thinking about graduate work, and he said to me, there's this new guy at Oxford, Rowan Williams. He's interested in exactly what you're interested in. And he made a connection with me. He'd met Rowan at a conference just the year that Rowan went to Oxford, when, of course, he hadn't picked up that many students yet. And I went and met him. And there we are. So I have no undergraduate degree in theology or master's degree in theology. You couldn't get away with it now. I just went straight from undergrad in classics to PhD in theology, which saved me from the systematicians.
You mentioned an earlier interest in chaplaincy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know if that term is a little different over there than it is here, but I'm wondering your interest in patristics. Not everyone is interested in how it intersects today with the church. Have you yourself found, and what are some of the examples of some of the writings and authors that you have heard and just discovered to be a wonderful voice for today, the church today specifically?
Actually, I'd start by answering that question at Oxford. I had a conversation with John Bear a few years ago about what we shared in common. And we were at Oxford at the same time in the late 80s, early 90s. And at that time, you had in one place, you had Rowan Williams, Callistos Ware, Oliver O'Donovan, Maurice Wiles, Teddy Yarnold was still alive, Anthony Meredith was teaching. You had a very broad range of scholars who were very much located in particular Christian traditions, but were also patristic scholars in the same place. And it was sort of obvious to us, oddly, that you did patristics as a way of doing theology. And there's a sense in which, that generation at Oxford was almost the very end of the Oxford movement. There were very, very few Anglicans at that point doing theology, one or two, myself at that time among them. But a lot of Catholic religious were there, a lot of American students from various denominations. And it was just accepted that doing patristics was a way of doing theology. Mm-hmm. And I think, especially after I moved to the US and I saw the bifurcation in the field, which has really been such a significant feature for the past 30 years, that you realize that now you need to think about that much more consciously. And I think one of the real problems that we have at the moment is that you have a lot of junior scholars who want to do patristics in a very rigorous way, but they want to do it because they have some Christian commitment. They want to perhaps teach in a seminary environment or work in a church. And there are remarkably few senior scholars in places with good graduate programs who have those theological interests. And that's really changed, I think, since I was starting out. If I try to think of the senior scholars who are sort of in the 50 to 70 range, who do patristics with a real theological interest, it's pretty slim pickings at the moment. That may change in another generation, but that's been a real shift.
Yeah, we've really taken on interdisciplinarity, right? I mean, that's kind of become a catchword now in the field.
That's everything.
Yeah.
Now, but it always was interdisciplinary. I mean, I think this is part of the problem. If you did patristics at Oxford during my period, you also went to seminars in classics and possibly seminars in history. You had to know how to work with those different traditions. Mm-hmm. And I think especially in the dialogue between early Christianity and the Greek and Roman world, you need to work with people who think that Christianity is basically nonsense. They're deeply wedded to doing Greek and Latin classics. That's interdisciplinarity. Mm-hmm. I mean, now what it tends to mean is commitments to certain sorts of theory as much as actual disciplines. And some of that's great stuff. I'm not, I don't want to be rude about it all. Some of that work is really excellent. But interdisciplinarity has become a term for something quite specific, I think.
And it's almost become an end in itself.
Yeah, yeah. Now, part of that, I think, is a sort of general crisis in the humanities about why we do what we do. I mean, if you come into doing something like patristics with a theological interest, it's fairly easy in some ways to account for why you do what you do. You think the church needs to know this. You know, you're part of a community of Christian scholars, whatever tradition you're in. You might think that your tradition needs to know more of this. You might think that you have an established, obvious place as a particular sort of scholar, the old sort of Anglican scholar priest tradition. But if you come into studying this as a reason, as a sort of secularized, perhaps a scholar who's never had any religious tradition or commitment, eventually at some point in your life will come the question, well, why am I doing this? And as we live in a period where the humanities struggles to define itself, because it's very worried about saying this material in and of itself is good for human flourishing, suddenly we're sort of stuck as to explain why we're here. And you see that a lot, I think, that you get into this out of enthusiasm and suddenly you're 40 and you think, well, why do I do this? And it's very difficult, I think, now to come up with a clear explanation why, because the humanities have not been particularly good at providing that explanation. You know, I think there are still great book schools which do this well. Small liberal arts colleges do it well, but not all. We've been having, actually, in my context, we have a new dean who's very good, and she's been trying to start this discussion about what the humanities are for. It's quite striking how difficult it is to find faculty members, I mean, across the disciplines, who want to talk in such an event, and how little they can actually agree on. But maybe that's off topic.
No, not at all.
No, not at all.
Well, and what I find interesting is I had not looked before at your education. And when I saw that you had studied classics and then went on to Oxford, it anecdotally, it seemed to me, that there was a time that, boy, that was sort of the gold standard path, was it not? Especially in the UK, to study classics, go to Oxbridge.
I was interviewed, actually, in my final year as an undergrad. I went down for an interview with Maurice Wiles, who was a dangerous, crazy liberal of the worst kind, but he was a great guy. I mean, he was a prince among men, was Maurice. And he interviewed me, and he made the same point. He said, it's quite striking that I haven't interviewed someone who has done classics and theology, with one exception, and I think the exception was Mark Edwards, for years, that this used to be what everybody did. It was a very standard British route into the field, and then it just disappeared. That's a lot to do with the collapse of training in classical languages in high schools. That is quite understandable. But I was the only person, I think, Mark is older than I was the only person in my intake who had done classics before going into theology. What you were beginning to see is what you see now as a near universal, at least in North America, is people who've done an MTS or an MDiv become interested and then wanting to do patristics, but what they have is a little bit of Koine, and that's it. And the task of getting up the languages and learning about ancient culture is just a monstrous one, compared to someone who's just been pushed through a degree in classics beforehand.
Yeah, the Greek exam that I had to pass here in Toronto was Jesus's encounter with the Samaritan woman in John 4. And I had, I think, 4 months to prepare for it. And they gave me, maybe not 4 months, a few months anyway. And they gave me the pericope well in advance. And John 4, Koine, Greek, is nothing like Origen or the Cappadocians. I mean, I finished it in about 30 minutes and I didn't even need a dictionary. I
Well,
think
I mean, another story which sort of illustrates the difference. I mean, I'm no linguist. I mean, I think that patristic scholars come in the variety of those who can manage with languages like me and those who are real linguists. And I'm not in that category in any way. But still, when I had my viva, Robert Marcus was my external examiner, and he did what was then the standard thing, which was to say on page so-and-so in a footnote, you cite Plotinus, blah, blah, blah. Here's the text. Can you begin at the top of the page and translate? And I've actually seen I've had one discussion here at Durham in the past few years about whether that's even a fair thing to do to a student. Because we simply don't get students who have studied any of those languages enough. Now, I don't think I made a particularly good job of translating Plotinus on the fly, but I had done enough Greek as a classic student and then working on Augustine with a lot of sort of Platonism that I could have a go at it. Whereas I think a lot of our students would make their way through and do a perfectly decent dissertation, but they simply don't any longer have the opportunity to have that time with the language.
I think that's right.
It's probably an unfair question and too large a scope to really get into, but I do wonder this discussion of the background and the absence of classics and the ancient languages for patrologists on the one hand. Do you see or suspect any correlation to those aforementioned sort of changed dynamics that today exist and the tensions in the field today? See any connection there?
I don't know. I mean, I tend to think, and it's an equally grand answer, I tend to think that the bifurcation in the field and the tensions we see are as much to do with the humanities trying to work out what they're for as anything else. So, I mean, I think there were a lot of scholars who are now fairly elderly, who really wanted to find a way to study patristic writers in a new, more historically sensitive way. So someone like Peter Brown, Peter wanted to study Augustine in a way that was completely free from Thomist reinterpretation of Augustine's thought. Okay, so he did it in a history faculty at Oxford, and he did his own thing. And I think that there was something there that we can all sort of resonate with, of putting these figures in historical context. And if you have a conversation with Liz Clark, who's a fascinating character who quite consciously wanted to change the field, to bring out new approaches, to take it out of the hands of people whose interest, whose interest was, I mean, she sent that to me in draft, and I found it a fascinating read. But she wanted to shift the field away from it being solely in the hands of people with a sort of interest in Dogma and Geschichte and nothing else. And she did that. And in a very impressive way. But a lot of what I find with people of a younger generations, of my generation and below, is they're not reacting against that. They're struggling to find a reason for why you do this now. Because if it's taken out of a theological context and it's put in a humanities context that struggles to define its own purpose, then you find people, really sort of thrashing around, trying to find a reason for doing this long term. What's its purpose? I think for people like Peter and Liz, and to some extent Philip Rousseau, although he always had a much stronger connection to the theological world if it wasn't apparent, they were reacting against a context and they were operating in a vision of the humanities that was a much more self-assured notion that studying this stuff was just good for society. And that's really evaporated, I think, in a lot of ways. It's all transferable skills. Anything other than saying these texts in and of themselves are significant. That's the problem.
Well, if we can now, I'd like to shift a little bit in terms of the texts that you've been looking at of late. I can't help but be delighted. Again, these last few years, you've really spent a lot more time in the 2nd century, and including your upcoming book project. What drew you to that era?
My choice of writing projects, I always have ideas, but the reality is that the things that I have written have revolved around 2 conversations at different periods. I had a conversation which changed what I was going to do with Stan Hauerwas in 1999, when I was still I finished my dissertation in 94, and after only 6.5 years, and I was trying to produce this thing into a book. And like a lot of people who were lucky enough in that period to get a job, so I didn't feel the immediate pressure, my Augustine book was like a sort of concertina, that it went out and then it went in again, and it never approached any completion. And one morning, Stan convinced me that I was just wasting my time and I should write my 2nd book first. I won't repeat the full contours of that conversation, but he persuaded me, quite rightly, that I wanted to write a book about the 4th century, and I was actually more prepared to do that because it wouldn't be some grand personal statement. So that was what I did. That was how I did the Nicaea book, because Hauerwas told me to, and it worked. It took me a couple of years longer than Stan thought it would, but that's life. And then I knew that I had to do the Augustine book next. As I was working on and towards the Augustine book, which I decided to write from scratch, not to revise my dissertation, I had a conversation with Robert Wilkin. Here, I wish I could do, I can't do the Hauerwas accent, and I can't do the Wilkin accent. And Wilkin basically said, look, you spend all your time in that Nicaea book saying that these controversies are about scripture, but you never talk about any damn texts. So I quite consciously decided to include a lot of discussion in the Augustine book of how he reads actual texts. Hence, for instance, my long discussion of what he does with John 5:19. And that really helped. But it became more and more apparent to me that what I needed to do was a book about the origins of what we'll call sort of classical Christian argument. How do Christians argue like this with scripture? That I was saying this was essential, but giving an account of the origins of that was what was a sort of obvious thing for me to do. And I had been teaching for a few years a course on patristic interpretation, and more realized that what I was interested in was the moment in the 2nd, 3rd century when Christian authors really adapt very clearly a consistent set of sort of grammatical and rhetorical principles in their exegesis, and that then becomes normative for everyone, or virtually everyone. And tracing the history of that moment and what it meant and what commitments came with it, because it's not just about method, it's a whole series of other assumptions. That a book talking about that was the next and obvious thing for me to do. I should say in all of that the other reason that I write in the way that I do actually comes from my long conversation with Michel Barnes back in the mid-90s. I started to write an article called Augustine in Contemporary Systematic Theology that was basically me just moaning about it. And Rowan, I showed a draft to Rowan, and he showed me the proofs of Michel's article in Theological Studies that has almost identically the same title. And so I gave up writing my article and wrote to him, and we used to have a sort of conversation every morning. He goes to bed late, I get up early. When I taught in Ireland for about 4 or 5 years, almost every morning we would have this conversation over our dial-up internet. And that really impressed on me the importance of doing this historically and properly to really make the argument, rather than just, making the grand statement that has no real basis. So that's another key influence. But it really came down to those 2 conversations and needing to give an account of why do Christians argue like this.
Now, can you give us Super Bowl advertisement type little preview of so what can we expect to see with this volume? What are some of the key theses maybe that you'd be willing to share at this point?
Well, okay. I do think it all comes down to the way in which Irenaeus and his peers react to Valentinian exegesis. That's the simple. There's a correlation there which seems so strong as to be causal. I think the way in which you see sort of Valentinian writers adopting scholarly practices and grammatical reading techniques to tease apart texts in aid of linking those texts to their own mythical themes and elements, that pushes Irenaeus to emphasize in the way that he does, reading the letter and the obvious meaning that's clear on its surface and all of that rhetoric. And so Irenaeus makes use of all of these techniques of analysis and constantly claims that his opponents don't really know how to read, etc., etc., trying to use the sort of cultural capital of ancient literary criticism. And that helps to push him towards a notion of a unified canon that you read first on the surface and you read as a whole thing. These things, I think, are already emergent in Christian discourse before, but because of his conflict with Valentinians especially, and other obvious groups who must remain nameless to make everyone happy, that pushes him towards a certain sort of exegesis. And then you see that identically, actually, in Clement of Alexandria and in Tertullian. Now, they, of course, Tertullian's to some extent dependent on Irenaeus, and I think Clement, it's controversial, but I think Clement knows Irenaeus. But so you see a common sort of emergence, I think. But it's important to note that it's not just a matter of method. There's a whole series of metaphysical commitments that come along with this. So they all have to emphasize a sort of unified significatory order. So things in creation can speak about the transcendent God, or things on the letter of Scripture can speak about God, but there's no further transcendence possible. And that's actually to create to sort of bound a metaphysical system within which texts refer and make sense. So I think there's a whole series of metaphysical presuppositions, which are, again, they're emergent earlier in Christian discourse, suddenly become essential. And out of this emerges a sort of particular culture of argument and set of assumptions. So that when you look a generation later and you've got an Origen, he's in some ways the inheritor of what's happened at the end of the 2nd century. It's very easy to treat him as sort of the first really smart Christian who knows all this stuff. But really, he's the inheritor. And he can take for granted that this is how you read a text and that Christians should be impressed by this, in part because of the success of that earlier generation. So it's really looking at the dynamics involved in Irenaeus and then shared by these other writers and why they seem to do this that gives us what becomes what I want to call sort of classical Christian exegesis and argument. Now, it's not simply about reading Scripture as if then doing theology is an extra. This is just how you argue. And it begins there.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because you're right. I mean, Origen is one of the first figures from whom we have a substantial corpus of literature that we would call commentaries, so biblical scholarship. But even in the New Testament, I mean, Matthew must have been composed in a community where they were debating how to interpret Jewish scripture in light of Christ. And then in Acts, so it's basically one long midrash. And then in Acts, the author, maybe turn of the 2nd century, first couple decades of the 2nd century, is kind of displaying a particular valorization for learnedness. I mean, you got Peter and James, or Peter and John, who he calls unlettered, agrammati. But then in contrast, you got Paul and Apollos, who are debating with anyone and everyone from the Scriptures. So already from some of its earliest iterations, you have, you know,
Yeah, no, there's a great deal of continuity, and I think if you look, at the Papias fragments, and if you want to say 110 for those, you've got another witness to the ease, the naturalness with which Christian authors turn to those sorts of techniques and culture. What you've got with the generation of Irenaeus is a much more consistent and fixed sense of, okay, this is how we will use the text. And you begin to get then a more universal sense of which practices are to be prioritized. And you begin to get authors displaying openly their knowledge of these practices against opponents. This sense of, well, I know how to read, and you guys are just bad readers by any standards. So there's a huge continuity, and this is why I'm also interested in the continuity between what happens at the end of the 2nd century and what comes before. It's quite natural to see how so many Christians would move into this way of doing things, because it does flow from what you find in earlier generations, whether you're thinking about Justin or whether you're thinking about those writers right at the beginning of the 2nd century. But there does seem to me a decisive shift which occurs in that later generation, but the way has been prepared for it within the texts of the canonical New Testament themselves.
I'm curious, so between Irenaeus and Origen, so when I read Irenaeus, you spoke of that impetus of him responding to the Valentinians on the one hand, interacting with that, and then on the other, reading him as he interprets through the rule of faith. And so he's interacting with Scripture not only as a direct response, but also through that predetermined, or whatever you want to say, lens. Whereas in Origen, as John said, you have him for the first time, someone simply sitting down and writing a commentary on Matthew, just the bulk of it. When are the first signs, or is he the first sign of someone not responding and not just arguing through a confessional rule of faith, but just, here's the text, let's work through it? What is that process?
Yeah, I think the difference is not simply in terms of sort of bare self-imagination, it's in terms of institutional possibility. Irenaeus is there, he's in a significant city, he clearly has resources, but he's the leader of a significant community, but he doesn't have the sort of leisure or obvious models of someone like Origen. And even if you look back to the way that someone like Justin is engaged philosophically, it seems most likely that he's sort of copying or participating in a certain sort of salon philosopher, very middle of the roady, but he's a Christian teacher and he's engaged with other Christian churches. Obviously there's a question of how we talk about unity and diversity in Rome, but let's see if we can avoid that for 5 minutes. But it's just institutionally fundamentally different from the resources that Origen has available to himself. And Origen, I think, has a vision of himself a bit like Clement before him, although it's much more difficult to know what Clement's resources and context are. But a bit like that, he's not simply thinking about techniques in the way that Irenaeus is. He's thinking about his own status as a commentator. And that really comes out, I think, in the Contra Celsum, where part of what he's arguing, I think, is not just Christians can be smart, but Christians can be philosophers and scholars just like you lot. And that's, there's an imagination of an institutional possibility that simply hasn't been possible before. I think the idea of producing commentary type texts in which you have your lemma and then you say your bit and then something else, that's closely related to institutional context and need as much as anything else. If you look in the dialogue with Trypho, where Justin quotes that passage maybe from his own earlier work, maybe from another author of Psalm 21:22, which does go through section by section in a very, very basic way. Who was that produced for? It's difficult to know. I mean, obviously, it's very simple, and some scholars have said he must be quoting this from another author. I don't think there's any necessity to that. Maybe it's from an earlier text by himself. But you can see there a scholar quite naturally perhaps preparing notes, you know, and this is how you prepare notes for things. You know, we have other texts from the 1st, 2nd century in a non-Christian context, a very, very simple basic commentary used for education or just for information to learned friends. It's very natural, I think, for Christians to do that when it matters. But the imagining of yourself as someone able to produce a full commentary like the heights of ancient scholarship, well, that demands an institutional setting. And I think for the first time, Origen seems to have that, perhaps with Clement, but Origen certainly has that.
Yeah, I think you're right. In your paper in the Journal of Early Christian Studies, you bring up the important book by Christoph Markschies on Christian theology and its institutions, whom I had on here just a few weeks ago. You know, if you want to circle back in time. I'm
not worthy to tie the sandals, etc.
But I think you're right, because with Justin, for example, you know, a salon philosopher is probably the best way to characterize him, because he's teaching out of the upstairs of a Roman bathhouse.
Yeah.
He probably doesn't have much space. But Origen has Ambrose, a very wealthy patron, who provides him with all the resources he needs. And you get a sense that Origen's circle is very much like that of Plotinus, where you got wealthy, learned individuals who have leisure to dedicate their time to the study of texts and philosophy. And it comes out in Origen's commentaries. He's not just somebody sitting down and writing a commentary. He's dictating to stenographers, but the content of the commentaries, like John and Matthew, for example, the classroom is dealing with debates that are happening at the time. So the discourse in John 1 on who is John the Baptist? You know, is he Elijah? The group is debating the theological doctrine of the transmigration of souls. You know, and Origen is pointing out how Heraclian gets it wrong because he doesn't follow the text, the narrative coherence of the text of John. So on the one hand, you got a reading practice that Origen is trying to teach, but it's within the background of the questions that his students pose to him from Heraclian's commentary, the Valentinian community, very much like what you're saying Irenaeus is doing in his Against Heresies.
I mean, it's interesting if you leap forward 150 years and you look at the beginning of Augustine's literal commentary on Genesis. He says, well, why am I doing this? In order to show pagans that we can do this.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to write a commentary that looks like the ones that you guys do. And I think if you look, you know, the first book of Origen's commentary on John, there's a huge amount of showing off.
Yeah.
The analysis of titles is just excessive by any standard.
Yeah.
And you know, whether it reflects what he's doing in class, certainly in a literary form, there is a sort of celebration of, look, Christians can do this too. That I think is really significant. But again, it depends on him having the resources to do it. I don't know who could have done that before him.
That's a great
but
point.
the techniques he's using, you know, methodologically, he's dependent on the developments of Irenaeus' generation and peers, in which I link Clement rather than seeing him as different. Institutionally, he's dependent on the huge wealth of Ambrose.
Yep.
Clearly, that's absolutely right. I mean, the question of where you place Clement is very significant, and I'm not sure about that. What sort of library does he have access to, etc., etc.? Who's paying for him? What's his function? You know, we could go around on that one for some hours because we won't be able to solve any of the questions.
Yeah.
But Clement already can do line by line commentary when he wants to, but it just doesn't suit the practice he's engaged in, I think, if anything.
So when might we hopefully expect this volume that you're working on, the second century one?
Well, it's only 6 years late. It's what, according to the contract, it's 6 years late. Now, 3 of those I was department chair, so I didn't do anything then. The year after that, I was recovering in a dark room, so I didn't get that much done. So that's 4 of those 6 years. So I'm hopeful by the end of this academic year. It's got 9 chapters. 4 of those chapters need about a week each to finish off and send them to someone. So it's getting there. It's just a matter of time. I mean, I've found teaching online in a current mess incredibly time consuming. I'm not getting a huge amount done, but I'm not alone in that, you know. We've got 4 kids at home trying to study, you know, trying to teach. And, you know, we had a committee meeting online this morning that probably should have taken an hour and a half, and it ended up taking 2.5 hours. But I won't say anything about my colleagues. So it's just taking a while. My wife always says that I'm a genius at the first 25% of any project. And then I'm reasonably competent at the next 80%, but the final 5%, I'm just useless. And that's actually true. I don't finish books or articles, I stop. And some people are really good finishers. I've just never been able to do that. I tend to stop and just sort of give up and hand it in. So,
well, there are a couple of other books that are dealing with this subject too that have come out recently, right? Doesn't Gregory Snyder have a monograph that's fairly recent? So this is kind of new territory, I think, in scholarship. Second century.
Well, I think that certainly you'll know yourself, there's been such a rise over the past 30 years of scholarship on ancient literary culture, especially among Christians, that it is very, very important. And there are so many really good studies now of individual authors. So Carl Berglund's book, which has just come out on Origen's use of Heraclean. Hang on, guys. There you go. Origen's references to Heraclean.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I saw that. Yep.
Yeah, you know, it's an excellent study, but by its nature as a dissertation, and as a very focused dissertation, like a lot of these, it's not really trying to make a statement about the grander situation and the shifts that are underway. And like all of these statements, I think, you know, one of the ways in which sometimes I disagree with these statements is that Valentinians are always misrepresented, of course, and they're really just wonderful, friendly people that you'd want round for a barbecue, and they're probably right about everything.
Of course.
I've no problem. I mean, I think it's heuristically important. Yes, you know, they're second century Christians. I don't feel a need to draw a great boundary, but I think there are reasons why people like Irenaeus and Origen end up winning the day. There's an intellectual sophistication and completeness about their project for which I still want to make a theological argument. So my book, I think, is more intentionally theological, and it is trying to make an argument about the major shift that's underway and how we think about that. But it is interesting because I drafted a version of, I don't know, 75% of it in 2014-15 when I was on leave, on sabbatical. And there has been a lot of literature since to catch up with. I mean, it's a really growing area.
It really is, yeah.
But remarkably little on Irenaeus's own techniques. Yeah. That's a surprising omission. But as you yourself know, the literature on this sort of stuff in Origen it's almost impossible to keep up with.
Yeah, thank God for his homilies on the Psalms that they found not too long ago. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had anything original to write. In your Jex paper, you make some interesting claims. One of them is you call Irenaeus you say that he's doing anti-allegorical reading,
Yeah.
but then you qualify that. You say, well, that doesn't mean that he doesn't do allegory. And what I was thinking of reading this is, on the one hand, you're absolutely right, because in the passages you point out, and it's very difficult because he's not doing commentary. So when you try to extract exegetical techniques or reading strategies from something that's not commentary, that's quite difficult. I mean, with Origen or with later commentaries, you can do that quite easily. But a couple of questions I have. One is, how did you find, was it easy, difficult, was it tricky to ask these kinds of exegetical questions from a text that's not doing formal exegesis? And second, this anti-allegorical approach, I always come back to the questions of, do these early writers think of allegory in the same way we do? Because Origen will use allegory and tropology, typology. He'll seem to use those almost interchangeably without really making clear distinctions between the different genres. So those are two questions that I have.
Yeah, I think there are three questions. I mean, I think that the question of how you read these techniques, when I started doing this, this is where I'm lucky in having been a classics student. So that what I tend to do is I will look through, or this is how I started it 10 years ago when I started on this, looking through Irenaeus, looking for anything that looks like technical terminology. If I find something, I look it up in Lausberg or in appropriate other tools and try and explore it. And then I try and find classical parallels. So I can say, okay, when he says when he's doing this, that's like, here are the classical parallels. And you can get quite a lot of progress like that. Of course, a lot of the time you don't find technical terms, although it's interesting how many you do find in Irenaeus. But where you don't find technical terms, then you can only really approach it if you've got some knowledge of useful contemporary texts. And I like to work with some classical texts, and I think, well, can I find a passage in Cicero that does the same sort of thing, or a passage in Plutarch, so that you can gradually draw out correlations and say, well, he doesn't name what he's doing here, but it's clearly an example of this. I think, that's how you have to go about that. It's quite difficult work, but an awful lot will reveal itself eventually. I think the question of, I've forgotten where I was going now. So that's how you get the techniques. Give me the question again in 2 seconds.
The allegory.
Oh, yes.
Defining allegory basically is what.
Okay, sorry, I'm back on track. Okay. When I say it's anti-allegorical, what I mean is there's an anti-allegorical rhetoric that Irenaeus likes to use. And the parallel there that I use in that article, and a bit more extensively in the book, is the sort of thing that you find in both Cicero and Plutarch. When Plutarch wants to attack what he sees as bad allegory, he'll do all the sorts of things that Irenaeus does and say, well, that's stupid, that text isn't like that, it's plain on its surface, and blah, blah, blah. It's a sort of rhetorical way of attacking another person's allegory. But actually, it says nothing about whether you yourself as an author also value allegorical reading, which Plutarch clearly does in a certain restricted context. And in the same way, in the book, I've got 2 chapters on Irenaeus and allegorical reading, where, of course, you find that in book 4 of Against Heresies, it's absolutely essential, and he's deeply invested in it. And I think there's not a huge tension, but there is a sort of fun irony that he'll spend his time up until that point attacking these Valentinians for not really knowing how to read the plain sense of the text, and then develops the densest account of non-literal reading up to that point in Christian literature. But that's not surprising when you compare him with what pagan authors are doing at the same time. In terms of your last question, is almost a question about what term do you use to describe this? Do you call it allegory? Do you call it something else? Well, as we all know now, allegory versus typology doesn't really help us very much.
Yeah.
That doesn't get anywhere. You can come up with a really fancy, complex diagram like Frances Young does in her Exegesis and Christian Culture book, but I think that's way too unwieldy and doesn't really help. And even she, in the end, opts for this version between, she opts for a sort of twofold distinction between iconic exegesis and something else.
That's remember. Right, yeah, and I think a more general distinction between philosophical and rhetorical.
Yeah, which I don't think there's any water in that bucket at all. I don't think that won't hold anything. But you are faced with the reality that all of these authors use multiple terminologies, and it doesn't really matter to them.
Yeah.
Okay. So we know that allegoria is a reasonably new word within a sort of 100 years or so in Irenaeus's day. He uses a huge range. Actually, in the current version of the 2 chapters I've got on this, I've decided to call it typical exegesis because it represents the use of tupos. And typical, if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, used to have this meaning. And I was just searching around for a word that doesn't set off the sort of neuralgic reaction that the word allegory does, because everyone knows it's bad. And so I've gone for typical. It's very difficult to find an appropriate term because we've become so invested in them, mostly for modern theological reasons.
Yeah, that's interesting, because this kind of ties back to the earlier discussion we had towards the beginning of this video. So many of these debates that I find on, allegory versus typology and what's legitimate Christian exegesis was born out of these Protestant Catholic debates about pure unadulterated Christianity versus the Hellenized Platonic form of Christianity. And to be honest, I get kind of tired of it, but for some odd reason, although we seem to know now that these are imprecise terms, there still seems to be so much of that being assumed, a pure Christianity versus a Hellenized Christianity. When I talk to students and even younger scholars, it lingers.
Well, I still think you find that whole trope of Hellenized Christianity is very significant, and that needs careful discussion. And you also still find the situation that you can work in all sorts of institutions, and your colleagues in biblical studies will be incredibly diverse. Like they are at Durham, we have a great range of people. Some of them are deeply interested in sort of modern canonical criticism, reader response sorts of things, all of these things. But there is still a sense that whereas you could teach a course called canonical criticism, you couldn't teach a course called allegorical reading and have it count as a biblical studies course. But that's still, you're still beyond the pale at that point. And I think this is a tension. Theologians, Protestant or Catholic, find it rather difficult to say simply, okay, this is the legitimate way of reading the text. It's governed in these ways, and we should learn to do it. But, those of us who exist in liturgical traditions would find ourselves in a deep problem if we said it's not possible, because our liturgical traditions are built on it. But how you teach it responsibly and historically and alongside other ways of reading the text is just a mystery. That's not really, that's a task for the future. Biblical studies and theology have a much more fruitful discussion than they did 25 years ago. But there's a long way to go.
It makes me think, as you talk about that dynamic, I've been thinking of in my head some of the publications the last 5-10 years with Irenaeus, and how there's been not a mountain, but certainly an uptick of literature on him and philosophy and rhetoric. And then I'm realizing, on the other hand, there's also been an uptick in his reception of the scripture, how he's reading it, but they're almost two entirely different set of scholars, aren't they? And so I'm curious as to, it sounds like your book's going to try to bridge that in a way, and perhaps Father John Bear has done a little bit of that as well, for sure. But yeah, you can definitely see the divide there.
You can see the divide. Yeah, maybe it's coming together. I mean, I'm deeply invested in that because I think that, early Christian doctrinal disputes are exegetical, but that doesn't mean they're not philosophical. You can't separate the two. In the case of Irenaeus, I mean, I think that the work that's been done, since Robert Grant in the 50s through to Brigman's newest stuff, is really helpful in saying Irenaeus actually knows some stuff philosophically. The level at which he knows it is still really significant. I think it's like Justin. He's philosophically educated, but I'm not sure that he's made his way through a full course there. But it is there. But trying to talk about that without separating that from his exegetical interest is really important to understand almost any early Christian author. And we're still struggling to do that because of how we, across different Christian traditions, think about the relationship between exegesis and philosophy. It just makes it really difficult to read these guys and say, well, this is how they put it together, and maybe it works. But there are people, I think, who are beginning to do that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. A few years back, I gave this lecture on Origen's homilies on the Psalms and looking at his reading strategies and his use of philology, textual criticism. And afterwards, this woman came up to me and she just started arguing, that, was he a philologist or a philosopher? Because you can't be both. And I was just, okay. That is so entrenched still in so many people's minds that a textual critic is distinct from a philosopher. But when you look at these, what Alexander of Aphrodisias is doing his philosophy within the context of writing commentaries on Aristotle's works.
Yeah.
And commentaries are being used in Plotinus's academy. So it's just that distinction breaks down. And I think we need to, there's still some more work left to do.
Some people see this, of course. The English scholar that Harnack really liked was Edwin Hatch in the 1860s. And if you look at his Bampton lectures about the influence of Greek education on Christianity, I forget what the title is exactly. I can't dredge it up. But he's interesting because he says, well, the real way in which Christianity is ruined is through Greek education, because it teaches you to read texts in a certain way. But he's really got the point. And then philosophy comes along, if you like, afterwards, because once you've started to think in the categories of grammar and rhetoric, then you naturally sort of progress towards the philosophical. And I think that's an insight in some ways that's much more the way we think about it than the way that previous generations thought about Hellenization as Christians stumbling around and reading some philosophers. And Hatch realizes that once you have philology in Christianity, there's a sort of Christian Hellenism, to use a rather loaded term. It's just inescapable. It's fascinating. I think he's basically right.
Hatch or Harnack? Hatch.
Hatch.
Yeah.
I mean, the only thing I disagree with, I think it was a good thing, and Hatch thinks it was a disaster. I'm not a great believer in the simple moral message of Jesus. But in terms of, it's like Harnack. In terms of historical analysis, at some level, you think, no, I disagree with that. At some level, the big presuppositions you don't agree with, but you should never not read Harnack, because in the nitty gritty, this is a guy of such intelligence that if you dismiss it, you miss so much.
He's hard to track down, though. I keep looking for his books on Amazon, and they always cost a fortune if they have them. Yeah.
Well, there you go. Reprints. This is how you can make your fortune, John.
There you go.
Whitford stock. Look at those guys.
So it's about 1 o'clock now. We've been on for almost an hour. I did want to talk a little bit, maybe before we wrap things up, about our wonderful little conference that we have coming up on New Horizons. I hate that title. Don, how did you come up with that title?
That was your idea. Give me a break.
Because in
Here's my paper.
Oh, you got it. Oh,
Oh.
wonderful.
Draft of my paper.
Wonderful. So the whole point of this conference is to talk about this discussion of patristics and theology and theory and how this all works together. So how's your paper coming along? It looks like you've got a good draft of it. Give us a little preview of what you're going to be talking about.
Nope. Well, I've got a sort of draft, and I said I'm going to finish this last week, and now it's this week. But this is an attempt to talk about what the relationship between patristics and actual theology should be. I'm very much focused in a Catholic context, but that should stimulate some discussions. My concern is that the whole ressourcement project concerning patristics was a failure, because after the Second Vatican Council, you had the rise of sort of modern Catholic systematicians who relegated doing patristics to being a historian. So you never had the emergence of a type of theology that was really deeply invested with patristic learning as an obvious partner. So I'm trying to say directly what I don't really want to say directly about what went wrong and how it should go right. So this is quite a programmatic thing for me. The little inscription at the top is from Dracula. That's the best bit of this paper. I love Dracula. I read it years ago, and about 10 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago, I said to my wife, you should really read Dracula. She was looking around for a book to read, and I got one of those looks that says, this is one of those movies. I said, no, the book. I mean, the book is brilliant. Yeah. Everyone knows the best movie is the one with Christopher Lee in, but the book is never been put in a movie because it's so good. And she was converted. And she's been re-listening to Dracula recently. So I came into the room last week when I was writing this, and she was listening to Dracula, and it's Jonathan Harker's diary. And it's the bit where he is, if you haven't read it, guys, read the book. And he's just seen Count Dracula climbing out of the window down the wall of the castle. And he's sitting in his room writing his diary in shock. And he says, unless my senses deceive me, the old centuries had and have powers of their own, which mere modernity cannot kill. And as soon as I heard it, I thought that is the tag for this paper.
That's a great line.
So that's where I'm going with this.
You know, I've been thinking about something similar too, because after the at the Vatican Council, you got this big shift in Lumen Gentium, where they start with the models of the church. And the first one was supposed to be the church as institution. But then they moved it, I think, to the last model, really shifting our ecclesiology. And to think of the church as an institution is almost anathema for a lot of individuals, because it conjures up images and power dynamics, you know, that people are so obsessed with these days. But after reading Marchi's book, I'm really starting to think about how the patristic period can get us to think differently about the church as an institution. I think that's right. I think we need to start recovering that.
In order for it to do that, departments, to put it, you know, in a very nitty-gritty way, departments have to accept that they need people doing historical patristic work as part of what it means to do theology. And I mean, I find with my own former students that I have some who teach in, you know, fairly traditional Protestant context, seminary type context, where oddly they are taken seriously, because as long as they can present patristic readers as doing scripture and having theological arguments, and they can, you know, pepper in a bit of B.B. Warfield, then suddenly you're okay. That it is counted as theology. But oddly, Catholics, I think, in Catholic departments have become some of the most neuralgic, to use a word twice in the same podcast, about the fact that if you hire someone in patristics, that's history. And, you know, she or he is over there doing history. They're not part of the conversation about what theology is. And I think that this is a huge problem. And it does show that for all the great work that the ressourcement people did, you know, my own sorts of heroes, it didn't work. And it didn't work because so many of them after the council, Congar went off in different directions. The others were religious who didn't see what was going to happen to departments that would become increasingly led by lay people. And a model of theology as a real conversation between centuries just never emerged. You know, so systematics becomes sort of equal to somebody who works on stuff since 1900.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think there's a deep problem there, which you really need to think about at a theoretical level, rather than it becoming a matter of sort of church politics. And then we'll see the great patristic revival #2.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
Donnie boy, any last words from you?
No, I was tempted to ask there, where he sees, especially in North America, the field going, but that's kind of a loaded question, and so we're.
Why are you speaking of him in the third person? He's right here with us.
I'm here.
Oh, is he still there? Oh, yeah, there he is. Hey, Lewis. Yeah, no, I mean, I think we've chatted about it a little in the past, but it is curious to watch.
Part of what happens in the field is driven by who puts money into it.
Yeah.
You know, and it's partly there are very few graduate programs you can go to where you could study patristic theology now. And as far as I can see, churches across the board have failed to see what they need and take action to support it. That's a real problem.
Is that true in mainland Europe as well? Would you say?
Well, the situation is different. Okay. I think partly because patristic studies is, at least in France and Germany and Italy, to my sense, is slightly more conservative in its intellectual models. So you've still got people doing all of the sorts of philological things and having the training that they used to do. You see the same divide, but it's not quite so vicious as it is in North America. And especially in the German situation, where you've still got ecclesiastical faculties driving things. You see the same problem in terms of how you get people doing patristics seen as theologians as well. You've got that problem, but it is slightly different. But certainly in Britain, for instance, it's just disappearing. And that's the reality. I mean, there are plenty of theology departments over here who just think, well, we don't need someone who does that. Well, that's an interesting statement.
I mean, we've gotten to the point now where there's a substantial segment of our learned society that wants to get rid of patristics from the name of our organization. That's kind of where we're at.
Yeah, there was a wonderful speech at NAPS, maybe almost 20 years ago, that Susanna Elm gave. I mean, it was just beautiful. Where we had one of these endless, what will the name of the society be? And she said, it all comes down to whether we prefer sex or naps.
Naps, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And, she did this, it was just beautifully done. But that's right. And I'm happy to talk about patristics. In some context, I'll talk about the study of early Christian theology, because there's no reason to have an argument about it. I don't really mind either way. But the reality behind it is, are we still nurturing a set of people who are really interested in the study of theology in this period, or is thought always epiphenomenal to these other dynamics? And I think that's an important one.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I'm looking forward to our conference coming up in what, about 6 weeks?
Yep. Okay, got to finish it this week.
Very good. We're looking forward to it, and very grateful to have this chance to chat with you.
It's been
Thanks
fun.
for taking the time.
Yep, absolutely.
Here it's now 6:10.
Yep.
I can hear people calling me to supper.
So let me stop it now, and have a good evening, Lewis. Don, have a good day.
Thank you for having me on.
Cheers.
Thank you both.